Welcome to onSodi.com.
This is part 2 of the two-part lesson for understanding contrast. We will now look at some images to see a little bit more about contrast application. I will be using some saved snapshots in these examples, and if you have a look at our Saving Raw Files Part 2, Saving Snapshots, you'll learn how to save snapshots. This image is very low in contrast and photographed in low contrast light. The histogram is central, which is typical of a low contrast image. Activating the second snapshot, and this is with the whites and the black points having been set, and you will notice that there is an increase in contrast and colour. The third snapshot is with additional contrast added. I will cycle through these three snapshots. No processing, and then the white and black points set, and the third stage with contrast added. Let's look at what happened to the image. Processing the black and the white points resulted in increased contrast and increased colour. And finally, with additional contrast, we get a further increase in sharpness, contrast and colour. Onto this image. The first snapshot is with no processing, and it has higher contrast in both the subject and the light. It has a histogram that almost fills the entire range. Looking at the second snapshot with the white and black points set, and the increased contrast is very small in comparison to our first example image. The third snapshot is with contrast added. There is more detail in the image, and there is also more colour. With this third image, the contrast would already appear to be quite high, even with no processing. But it doesn't have a deep black, as you can see from the histogram being vacant on the left-hand side. The second snapshot sets the white and black points, with just a mild increase in contrast appearance and colour. The histogram now looks fuller. The final snapshot is with contrast added, and the image has a richness in contrast and colour. In conclusion, we should set the white and black points first, as this adds contrast, and then we may add more contrast to suit the image. There are 3 additional videos to watch for more contrast control, but before we conclude this lesson, let's pause for a moment and have a look at the differences between the contrast slider in the Basic tab and some other methods to adjust contrast in Camera Raw. The contrast slider in the Basic tab will act like a seesaw. If you lift the highlights, the shadows will drop in proportion, and if you darken the highlights, it will lift the shadows in proportion, and therefore it adjusts the contrast. Increasing the contrast slider and the highlights are getting brighter and the shadows are getting deeper. Return that back to 0. If I reduce the contrast slider, the highlights go darker and the shadows get lighter. I'll do that again. Reduce the contrast, shadows become lighter, and highlights become darker. I'll double-click and reset to 0. Let's now have a look at this on some images. Increasing the contrast and everything changes. Highlights are lighter and shadows are darker. Reducing the contrast now, and the image looks really flat. On this next image, increase the contrast and the image looks sharper and denser. Decreasing the contrast, it starts to look flat and loses sharpness. Increase again and it looks much better. On this third image, increasing the contrast slider will increase the highlights. It will darken the shadows. You will also notice that the image looks sharper and more detailed with this contrast increase. But if I reduce the contrast and the image starts to look flat, the highlights drop and the shadows become lighter. It's not a good look. Return this back to 0. Let's now come back to the grayscale image and have a look at other ways to adjust contrast in a more specific manner. I'll come over to the Tone Curve tab. The Tone Curve tab is explained more in our 2 videos on the tone curve in the Raw Processing 301 course. I will now lift up the lights. It's just affecting the light side of the tones, not the shadows. But because this is lifting the light tones and making a greater difference when compared to the shadows, it is therefore changing contrast. Changing one tonal area will always change contrast. I will drop the dark slider to darken the shadows after the lights have been changed. These are more localized adjustments, lifting the lights and then dropping the darks, and this is known as a mid-range contrast boost. I will tell you a secret. Adding just a small amount of mid-range contrast will improve nearly every photograph. Onto this image, and instead of using the basic tab, I will simply come over to the dark slider and drop the darks to increase the contrast of the image. The image looks darker, but it also looks better. Come to the highlight and lift those up just a little bit, and we get a more defined contrast adjustment and a far better result. On this image, simply lower the darks, and by lowering the darks, it's starting to increase the overall contrast and things are looking quite dynamic. Lifting up the highlights, that's a bit too much, and then lower the highlights. With this image, I could drop the darks, and just by dropping the darks, the image starts to look different. The highlights at this stage haven't been changed. It's good to experiment with what level of change suits the image. It can take some experimenting. Lifting up the highlights just a little bit, and you can see that these local contrast adjustments are really quite effective. In conclusion, contrast adds depth and sharpness to a photograph. Contrast makes colour appear stronger. Adjust contrast after you have set the exposure and the white and black points. The contrast slider in the basic tab will adjust the light and dark tones in equal amounts. And try to use the curve tab for adjusting specific areas of contrast. Take your time, enjoy your photography, and practice as much as you can.